have twice a year, generally speaking, twice a year. This year it happened 3 times, but generally speaking, twice a year, there are forms updates that are done to our CAR forms library. So CAR goes in there, they create new forms, they change up the existing forms. I wish they would rotate the time schedule just a little bit because it just feels like poor planning. It's right at the beginning of summer, which is like the height of the busy season. So they do it in June. And then they do it again in December as we're trying to wind down for the holidays. We're trying to like wrap up our last few transactions. They go in there and they go, haha, we've done new forms. So that is what we're covering today is our December 2024 forms, updates, and new forms. So there are a few new forms. My desktop looks like a mess right now because it's hard to organize the forms based on acronyms because there's like 50 forms that have to be that we're going to go over today. So it's hard to organize those. So I've got them kind of laid out on my desktop, how we're going to go through them kind of. But so I've kind of got them grouped by what they cover. All of these forms are going to go into your library 14th, 15th on Tuesday. So they'll all magically appear in your CAR forms library on Tuesday. If you want to see them before that, the easiest way to do that is to log into CAR, like you're going to go into Zip Forms. On your front page of your Zip Forms, it's going to have a little box that pops up and says something about the red line versions for the forms updates. Click on that button. It'll take you over to where you can look at the summary form and then download all the forms that have had updates. We are not covering today all of the forms. I don't cover the forms that you don't interact with in like day-to-day business. So the ones that are like commercial properties, residential leases, all of those, I just don't even cover those because we don't do leases in our office. We don't generally do commercial property. So I'm just covering the ones that affect your residential business. If you have any questions as we go through these forms, don't hesitate to raise your little hand there in Zoom world. You can just unmute yourself and interrupt me. I would prefer that you don't throw it in the chat box. I'll try to keep an eye on it, but I'm just working off one screen today. And so it's hard to have too many windows open at the same time. That being said, let's get started. Let's see here. Usually when I go into full screen mode, just full disclosure, it takes me like 20 minutes to get out of it, but let's try it. Can everybody see the assignment of agreement form? Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see it or a thumbs down if you can't see it. I just want to make perfect. Thank you. All right. So this is the assignment of agreement form. This one doesn't have any major changes in case you've never seen this form before. This is the form on the residential purchase agreement underneath like investigation of property contingency. I think it's right there. It could be up a little higher. It talks about like the period that you can assign the contract. Okay. So it's assignment of agreement. It defaults to 17 days. This is the form that gets used if you want to assign that contract. And it can be used a couple different ways. One is if you want to add a buyer. So maybe you just have one spouse on the contract. You need to add the other spouse, or maybe they need a co-signer that needs to get added to the contract. You would use this form here, the AOAA form. You could use it to remove a buyer off the contract. So maybe you went in with both spouses. You get into underwriting. The lender says, hey, the spouse has to go. Get them off that contract. We would use this form to remove them from that contract. Or maybe you have like an investor, a wholesaler who entered into contract on a property. Now they're going to turn around and hand that contract off to another buyer. They're basically like a straw buyer. You are going to use this form to move it from the original buyer to the new buyer completely. So we can add buyers, we can take buyers away, or we can assign the entire contract with this form. The only change that they made, which makes sense, is here at the bottom. If the person that you're assigning the contract to is an entity, they now have a place for that so that you can identify that they're a corporation or a trust or whatever it might be. So if it's a non-individual assignee, a trust, corporation, LLC, probate, partnership, holding power of attorney, or other entities. So they've added that to the form. We see this already on the purchase agreement and the listing agreement, so I don't have to go through everything here. Just know that you're going to put the entity here. That's where the corporation, the trust, the partnership name would go, is on line number 2. And then the person who's signing, their name goes here on 4B, the name of the legally authorized signer. Okay. So that's how you fill out that section. That's the only change that was made to that AOAA form, the assignment of agreement. All right, there we go. I successfully closed out of that one. Then we have the buyer counter offer. Okay, so as you can see, what they normally do is they put the changes in red. I was gonna see if I could, oh, I can. Hold on just a second. I gotta move my toolbar around, my Zoom toolbar, because I can take this and blow it up for you all. So oh, that's a little too big. All right, right there. All right, so they've added a little stipulation down here. This is the buyer counter offer. We're going to see the same stipulations on the seller counter offers as well. So I may just skip over those. I may pull them up so you can see it. But section 3, it just says, hey, buyer makes this counter offer on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy by making this counter offer. Any previous offer or counter offer can no longer be accepted. Okay, that's original language. Then they added this counter offer is valid regardless of whether any previous offer or counter offer expired by its terms. Okay. So what's that saying there? You know, what happens is I get this question all the time is, hey, Amy, my offer or my counter offer expired. But yet then the buyer sent a counter offer back. So maybe the seller made we made an offer, seller made a counter offer. Maybe the seller had a short time period on the response for their counter offer. And now we're outside that. Buyers making a counter offer in response to an expired seller counter offer, right? So this is just saying that, hey, these terms are valid. Even if that seller counter offer expired, the buyer is still going to respond to it. Seller doesn't have to accept. So this is what that stipulates. It's just saying, hey, it's still good. Okay. Late acceptance, if the date of the seller's signature in paragraph 4, right up here, acceptance, is after the expiration specified in this document on 2A, the seller's acceptance is only binding if the buyer agrees to the late acceptance by signing below before 5 p.m. on the third day after the date this buyer counter offer is signed by the seller. Okay, so this is the fully ratified acceptance. Okay, so how does this work? Number 1, seller counter offer expired. Oh no, buyer makes a counter offer. This is saying that, hey, if the seller decides to respond, then they're extending the expiration of their counter offer. Okay, then the sellers come back and sign that they're going to accept it, but they're after the default is 5 p.m. on the third day after it's signed by the buyers. So we're on day 4. Seller signs that, okay, yeah, we're going to move forward with you, buyer. This is not automatically valid. So normally, if we have a buyer counter offer that gets sent out, seller signs it, we are automatically binding it in contract at that time that they sent that back to us. There's no way to get out of it except for our contingencies or normal ways that you would cancel a contract. It's a binding contract. What this is saying is, hey, if the seller agreed to the terms of this buyer counter offer after it expired, then it's not officially valid until the buyer signs this bottom section. So the only time the buyer needs to sign this bottom section is if the timestamp in section 4 exceeds the expiration in 2A. Okay, other than that, the buyers don't have to sign this. Buyers would sign that they're making the offer on 3. Sellers would sign that they're either countering it or accepting it in 4. So the only time we go down to number 5 is when the seller's signature is after the time stated in 2A. Any questions about the changes to the buyer counter offer? All right, fabulous. Moving right along, our next form is going to be our interim occupancy agreement. While that opens up, give me just a second. Be right back. All right, I have returned. We have our interim occupancy agreement. We use this, we don't see it very often. This would be used if the buyer is going to move into the property prior to the close of escrow. Okay, buyer interim occupancy agreement. Again, not a great idea. In certain cases, it might make sense, but for the most part, until that loan has funded and recorded, we don't want the buyer in that property because something happens last minute and they got to move out. That's a problem. We actually bought a house where the previous buyers had moved into the property and then their loan fell out at the last minute and they had to move back out. Okay, nothing is worse than that. Let me see here. It's showing this weird, I don't know that I can change it, but let's look for the changes on the interim occupancy agreement. I think it's just at the end for the entity buyers. Okay, so you got two things here. The first one is on page 7, I think this is 6, page 6 of 8. It just says that, hey, the scope of agency relationship. Okay, it's just saying that, hey, housing provider and tenant, so that would be the seller and the buyer, acknowledged and agree that unless otherwise agreed to in writing, the broker will not represent the owner, that's a seller, in any manner regarding the management of the premises. We're not entering into a property management agreement with the seller since the buyer's taking possession of it. Any representation duties that broker may owe to and any agency relationship that broker may have with either the housing provider, that's the seller, or the tenant, that's the buyer, related to the renting of the premises is terminated upon commencement date. Okay. And then there's a tenant positive rental payment reporting form, the TRPR, that's a new form so that it's incorporated in. So that's the only change. It's just clarifying the agency relationship, not a big deal there. And then at the end of this IOA, the interim occupancy agreement, they've done the same thing that we just saw on that other form where they've added in the assignment of the agreement, where they've added in that if it's an entity tenant. So if the tenant is an entity, who's represented to, or who's able to sign on their behalf. So those are the changes there to the interim occupancy agreement. That's the IOA form. Any questions on that form? I actually think they need to renumber. Oh, there's number 7. We've also got the entity, the peers page 7, the entity for the seller as well. And then it just says, just so you know, broker compensation, they've added principals and brokers. So they've just added that in there at the end. All right. So that's your IOA. That'll be the changes you see there. The next form that we have is our increased deposit addendum. We'll see this on the residential purchase agreement. This is a new form. So normally on the residential purchase agreement in the grid, you've got the deposit and then you've got the increased deposit. And then on the residential purchase agreement, there's teeny tiny lines where you spell out the terms of the interim occupant, or sorry, the increased deposit. Right. So this is, hey, our initial deposit is $1,000. We're going to put $10,000 more after 10 days or at the removal of contingencies or whatever it might be. Now there's just a little box saying increased deposit. I think it has a dollar amount and then it references this form here, the increased deposit addendum or the IDA. The following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated into the purchase agreement is the default. If you got your other box there as well. Dated, that's going to be the date on the upper left-hand corner of the first page of that purchase agreement. You're going to put in the full property address on the next line. You're going to put in the buyer's names and then the seller's names. Buyers and sellers are referred to as parties. Number 1 is increased deposit. Buyer agrees to deposit with escrow holder in the same manner as the initial deposit upon removal of all contingencies. Okay, so it's saying, hey, the default is upon removal of contingencies, or you could check the next box, which is a date. You put in a specific date, or you can check this next box, which is upon blank. Okay, so anything can go in there. The sum of blank dollars. So that's going to be the increased amount of the deposit. So if my initial deposit was 1,000 and my total deposit is going to be 10, then this might say $9,000. Okay, the default is removal of contingencies, but it might be a specific date or other terms. It could be just removal of seller's purchase of replacement property. Maybe we don't want to put too much money into escrow until the seller removes that, or maybe as an incentive for the seller to get that removed, or maybe it's after the sale of the buyer's property. So after the buyer's property enters into contract, then we do an increased deposit, whatever that might be, who knows, but there's so many options there. Okay. So on this line though is the amount of the increased deposit, not the total amount of deposits, just how much we're going to increase it by. Line 2 is the combined deposit. The combined total of the initial deposit and the increased deposit shall be, in my example, this would be $10,000. The initial was 1, the increased was 9, the total is going to be $10,000. It's going to fill that in there, or you're going to fill that in there. So you do have to do a little bit of math on this one. The application of the increased deposit to liquidated damage. If the parties agree to liquidated damage in this agreement, they also agree to incorporate the increased deposit into the liquidated damages amount by signing a new liquidated damage clause, car form DID, at time of increased deposit is delivered to escrow holder. So just know that in order for that to be part of the liquidated damage, you do have to sign a form when that another deposit is made. That's always been the case. Any questions on this increased deposit addendum? We don't see increased deposits very often, but there's a new form for that. All right. Everybody's so quiet today. We are moving right along. Let's go with the residential purchase agreement as our next one. Let me blow it up just a little bit. All right, so here is that line item on the grid D2, so 3D2, where it talks about the increased deposit. So instead of putting a line item or anything on there, we're just going to say, hey, see attached increased deposit addendum, car form IDA. Okay, we're going to just check that box, and then it automatically is going to add that form over. All right, the next form is that the inside the grid at the top. They are changing up the terms with regards to credit and seller's payment of buyer's broker. We no longer need the SPBB form. Thank you, CAR, for eliminating a form, okay, that we use all the time. So G2, 3G2 is additional seller credit terms. This does not include buyer broker compensation. So in the past, we've talked about the fact that, hey, you could negotiate the commission as either straight up commission on that SPBB form, or we can negotiate it as a credit to the buyer from the seller. And we don't have to disclose what that's for. It's just buyer's closing costs. Well, so we still have that line G1, seller credit to buyer for closing costs, and then additional seller credit terms. This doesn't include buyer broker compensation. Okay, so that's where you would put terms there. So you'd fill out there, you'd fill out. So I would say G1, don't use it for broker compensation any longer. Okay, the only way we're going to negotiate broker compensation is going to be on G3. Okay, so here we've got the seller credit to buyer on G1. It says for closing costs. And then G2 is additional seller credit terms. So in case there's something else in there, but we don't want to include buyer broker compensation in that seller credit to buyer. And then on G3, that's where we negotiate now our payment to buyer's broker. We're negotiating on behalf of the buyer for the seller to cover their portion of the commission to us as their agents. You would check this little box here, seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker. Buyer compensation affirmation, okay? So again, we don't need the SPBB form anymore after Tuesday, so just don't write any offers until Tuesday. No, I'm joking. Write offers all weekend long. Seller agrees to pay out of the transaction proceeds blank % of the final purchase price, and if applicable, blank, or if checked, blank towards the obligation of the buyer to compensate buyer's broker. Okay, we're going to fill that out just like it's filled out on our BRBC form. Okay, just keep in mind too that on this residential purchase agreement, it does not have to match our BRBC form. The amounts here can be less than or equal to what's on the BRBC. So when it comes to this compensation, it can be less than or equal to. It can't exceed the amount on that BRBC. Okay, buyer's compensation affirmation. Buyer affirmatively represents at time of this offer is made, buyer has a written agreement with the buyer's broker and that it's valid. It covers this property and it provides for compensation of no less than the amount stated above. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
So say you put 2.5% there, and then the seller comes back with no, we're only going to do 2%. What do you do in that instance?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're going to have a conversation with your buyer as part of that counter offer of here's what you agreed to pay me, 2.5% or whatever X%. We're just going to say X% so we don't get in trouble. Okay. Buyer agreed to pay X%. Seller's agreeing to pay Y, which is less than that. And then, so buyer, that would mean that based on this counter offer, you would have to come in with an extra 0.5% or whatever that is, right? The difference between X and Y. If you want to, you could say, hey, why I put, this percent on the BRBC, but I'm willing to work for a little bit less. So I'm willing to do a modification. So you could accept this. Number one, you could always counter the seller's response back at 2.5%. The other option is buyer pays the difference. Third option is you do a modification of terms to the buyer representation agreement to reduce the amount of commission owed to you as that part of that transaction. And you may want to make it, if you decide to go that route and you say, hey, buyer agreed to X, seller's offering Y, I'm okay with Y, I'll take that. Instead of reducing with that modification of terms the entire commission from the BRBC, what you may want to do is make it property specific. If buyer closes on XYZ street, broker to accept to reduce commission to Y%. Okay, on that modification of terms, so that if they decide not to purchase that, it goes right back up to the original amount that you work at and getting negotiated on the next offer, but on that property, it drops it down for them. Anastasia, did that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
You are welcome. Keep in mind that when we have conversations about commission, we try not to use percentages in that conversation to make sure that we aren't saying that there is an average or usual commission. So commissions are always negotiable. All right, there you go. The other thing that was changed is if there's no TOPA down here on M3, occupied units by tenant or anyone other than the seller, we would check this box here, for tenant occupied property addendum. And if it's attached, if it's not attached, so we didn't check this box and it's not occupied, then we would go to paragraph 7A. So it's just referencing in that. So we'll check on 7A here in a minute. Let's see, there's nothing on that page. All right, I don't think we have anything on these pages. I think we're good. Oh, here's 7A though. Let's check 7A. Occupancy. Buyer intends to occupy as primary residence, see paragraph 3E3, and unless otherwise agreed to in such as in car form TOPA, the unit the buyer intends to occupy shall be vacant at time possession is delivered to buyer, and the property contains more than one unit within 3 days after acceptance. Buyer shall give seller written notice of which unit buyer intends to occupy. Occupancy may impact available financing. Seller shall disclose to buyer if occupied by tenants or other persons other than the seller, and attach car form TOPA in the counteroffer if not part of buyer's offer. So that TOPA form should either be included with the offer or included with the counteroffer. So if the buyer is aware that there is a unit they're putting an offer in on that isn't occupied by the seller, okay, so tenant or anyone other than the seller, they should include that TOPA form, the tenant occupied purchase addendum, with their offer. If not, the seller should include it as part of the counteroffer and disclose that the unit is not occupied by the seller. Okay, so that's what 7A does there. All right, I don't think we have any other, defensible space. Oh, here, on point of sale requirements, section 10B2A, unless otherwise agreed, defensible space compliance shall be determined as agreed on car form FLDS. That's the fire hardening disclosure. So just kind of keep that in mind that that's going to be disclosed through that form. Continuing on with our residential purchase agreement. I hate how it's displaying this, but that's all right. We'll survive. All right. Here we've got that. All right. And then we've got another change here on page, I think this is 11. Compensation, the broker's rights and agents compensation. They've added one. Timing of broker compensation, seller or buyer or both as applicable, agree to pay compensation to broker as specified in a separate written agreement between broker and that seller or buyer. Compensation is payable upon close of escrow, or if the escrow does not close as otherwise specified in the agreement between broker and that seller or buyer. Buyer representation, seller payment to compensate buyer's broker. Buyer affirmatively represents that buyer and at this time has made an offer has a written agreement with the buyer's broker that is valid, it covers the property, and provides for compensation of no less than the amount stated in paragraph 3G3. If any representation 1 through 3 is not true, then seller has no obligation to pay buyer's broker. The amount of compensation, if a percentage, will be based on the final purchase price. Buyer's obligation to pay buyer's broker shall be offset by the amount that the seller pays buyer's broker. Third-party beneficiary, seller acknowledges and agrees that buyer's broker is a third-party beneficiary of this agreement and may pursue seller for failure to pay the amount specified in the document. Okay, so if these 3 statements, if the BRBC is not valid, if it's not signed prior to this being signed, if it doesn't cover the property, or it provides for compensation of less than the amount stated on the grid, then it's not valid and seller doesn't have to pay. So make sure all those things are valid. Any questions so far before we move on? All right. This is the next section here. They've elaborated the escrow instructions. This used to be a short little box. Now it's kind of broken into sections. I can't seem to keep my little pictures out of the way. Hold on. Let's see if we can get those off to the side. All right. So joint escrow instructions section 19 now has escrow instruction paragraphs, escrow holder general provisions, copies, statement of information, tax withholding instructions, broker compensation, right? We've now got in a paragraph here that the instructions to the escrow holder, okay? That's just, hey, escrow holder shall provide buyer a closing statement or other written documentation disclosing the amount of compensation paid by buyer's broker. Escrow holder shall provide to seller a closing statement or other written document disclosing the amount of compensation paid to seller's broker. And if applicable pursuant to paragraph 3G3, that's the seller's payment to buyer's broker, or other mutual instructions of the parties, the amount paid by seller for buyer's broker's compensation. Escrow holder's obligation pursuant to paragraph 19D is not intended to alter any pre-existing practice of the escrow holder to issue as applicable joint or separate closing statements. Escrow holder's obligation pursuant to paragraph 19D is independent of, but may be satisfied by, any closing statement mandated by buyer's lender. Okay, E is just the invoices. F is verification of deposit. Here it pulls in that new form, the IDA form, the increased deposit addendum, and then delivery of addendum of amendment. So they've just broken it out. Okay, that's the only change there on pages 12 and 13. All right. Here's page 14, liquidated damage, arbitration of disputes, nothing there. Here the other thing that they've done is they further elaborated on the entity buyers. So that's the buyer signature block. They've updated that information there, same as I described it before. And then on the seller's signature block, it's going to have the same changes to the legally authorized signer if it's a representative capacity disclosure where it's not an individual buyer or seller. We would use this, we see this a lot on residential purchase agreements when the property is held in a trust. So just kind of keep that in mind. That would be an entity seller. Okay. So that's all I've got there for the residential purchase agreement. Any questions before we move on?
No, ma'am.
Okay, just the no major changes except for that the elimination of that SPBB form. So no longer required to utilize that SPBB form. We can just put it on the purchase agreement. All right, goodbye purchase agreement. What's next over here? We have the wooden balconies and stair addendums. This one gets used for properties with 3 or more units that has balconies, decks, or stairways. They have new requirements for that. So just so you know, that go into effect by January 2026 to make sure those are safe. So here's the requirement to deliver reports to buyers. They have a requirement. If the report shows that any portion of the elevated elements are in need of repair and such repairs have not been made, a statement that the repairs have not been made right? So they're going to deliver that, or up until January 1st, 2026. I think this was originally 2025, so I think they bumped it out a year. Disclose if no such report has been made. So not only if they have a report, they have to disclose, and repairs were recommended, they have to state whether those were completed or not, or if they have no such report. If it's in a condo, the HOA is going to have similar obligations. So you're going to start seeing this form as part of condo purchases. It should be incorporated into those, or townhomes where there's balconies or other things. Okay, authorized inspectors for common interest developments, licensed structural engineers, licensed architects, or licensed civil engineers. For other properties, a licensed architect, licensed civil or structural engineer, a building contractor holding any or all of the A, B, or C-5 license classifications issued by the Contractor State Licensing Board with a minimum of 5 years experience as a holder of the aforementioned classifications or license in constructing multi-story wood frame buildings, or an individual certified as a building inspector or a building official from a recognized state, national, or international association as determined by the local jurisdiction. These individuals shall not be employed by the local jurisdiction while performing these inspections. Woo! Right? It's just outlining who can do those inspections. So if I were you, I'd make sure over the next few months that you create some relationships with, structural engineer, an architect, civil engineer, and make sure who you have as your contractors if they meet that criteria. That way, you've got somebody in your pocket, not in your pocket per se, but somebody in your arsenal that can complete those inspections as necessary. So just kind of keep that in mind. But this form's been around for a while, but they changed that. Like I said, I think it was originally 2025, and now everything except the HOAs are 2026. So keep that in mind. The HOAs are 2025. Everything else is 2026 for the wood balconies and stair addendums. Again, that's only for properties with 3 or more units. So triplexes are bigger. Any questions about that form? All right. The next one we have is our seller counter offer. Our seller counter offer just has the same terms that were in the buyer counter offer, which is this offer is valid regardless of whether any previous offer or counter offer expired by its terms. Okay, because we didn't accept the other offer, this is still valid. So the residential purchase agreement expired. The sellers can still make a counter offer to those buyers. The buyers don't have to move forward. Okay, late acceptance, paragraph 6, if the date of the buyer's signature in paragraph 5 is after the expiration. In paragraph 2A, buyer's acceptance is only binding if seller agrees to late acceptance by signing below. So this is the same as the buyer acceptance, the seller's role. So again, we only use section 6 in this case. On the buyer counteroffer, it was 5, but section 6 on the seller counteroffer if the buyer signed it after the expiration period. So if the timestamp on the buyer signature was after the expiration in 2A, then the seller would have to sign to fully ratify this contract. Okay, so that's the seller counter offer. We also have the seller multiple counter offer, right? So we've got the counter offer for individual offers. We're just making one counter offer. And if we received multiple offers, then we can do a seller multiple counter offer off to several people. We've got the same provision here that the counter is valid regardless of whether any previous offer or counter offer expired by its terms. And we don't have the other paragraph in here. We still have late acceptance. Let's see, hold on. Oh, come on, display correctly. Here's where the seller's signature goes. So seller makes the offer, they sign under 5. And then 6 is the acceptance of the counter offer, just verifying that, hey, it's not valid. Buyer, if you sign that you're accepting this counter offer, you're not officially in contract until the seller signs paragraph 9. Then we go on to the second page. The second page is the acceptance. That's where the signature would go for the buyers. Okay, that's what we just covered above. Section 8 is the selection of accepted multiple counter offer. So by signing below, seller accepts this multiple counter offer and, if applicable, agrees to extend the expiration date for buyer's acceptance to the date that the buyer has signed in paragraph 7. So how this multiple counter offer works is buyer or seller signs to make the offer, buyer signs that they accept it, and then seller would come back, and if they're going to move forward with this buyer, because they've made, let's say, 3 counter offers out to different buyers, they're going to move forward with this buyer. They're going to sign here in section 8A that they accept these buyers. Okay. B is you've got a box there that they could accept the multiple counter offer in backup position. So this doesn't cause those buyers to move forward yet, but it holds them in line. So first buyer cancels, next buyer, the buyer in backup position number 1 is now the buyer of the property. They can't go market it to other people. It locks you in as a buyer's agent. It locks your buyers into this property if something happens to the first. So it makes it, they can't remarket it. They can't accept a different offer. They got to go forward with the buyer in backup offer number 1. Okay, seller's going to make that. It's a counter offer to put it in backup position. So if the buyer is okay with being put in backup position, then buyer signs down here on B where it says buyer. Okay, so seller signs section 6, buyer signs section 7. If seller's going to move forward with buyer, then seller signs 8A. If seller's going to move forward with buyer and then it's over, just so you know there, it's over if we sign 8A. We don't have to sign any more on this document unless a certain situation happens, which we'll cover here in a minute. If they're going to put it in backup, then instead of signing 8A, the seller's going to sign 8B. And then buyer has to agree to be put up in backup position by signing 8B as well. Okay. If the seller accepts, we just skip over B. Okay. Late acceptance. If the date on the seller's signature in paragraph 8, right here, the box, is after the expiration in paragraph 6, seller's acceptance is only binding if buyer agrees to the late acceptance by signing below by 5 p.m. on the 3rd day after this date of the seller multiple counter offer is signed by seller in paragraph 8. So again, section 9 only used if the seller accepted this after the expiration of the buyer's response. So super confusing, but that's all right. You guys will get it. I believe in you. So 9, again, only used for late acceptance. Any questions about this multiple counter offer before we move on? All right. Our next form, we're going to move over to our seller forms. Oh, that one's out of place. It probably moved all of mine. All right. Here's the agency disclosure form. There was just a quick little change on the agency disclosure. This one you'll see on both the buyer and seller forms. You'll see it with the purchase agreement. You'll see it with the listing agreement. You're going to see it with the buyer representation agreement. Buyer's agent can, with buyer's consent, agree to act as agent for the buyer only. This includes a buyer's agent under a buyer broker representation agreement with the buyer. Okay, so it's just explaining the different ways that you can be represented in a contract. And now it's talking about, hey, this includes buyer's agent under buyer broker representation agreement. That's the only change on that form. There's a little bit on page 2 as well. There, where it's just the legal jargon on the second page is clarified there. Okay, so that's your agency disclosure. The next one is I believe this is the compensation agreement. So you would utilize this form. We did a whole lesson on these compensation agreements because they're a little bit tricky. We have our regular like listing agreement and BRBC, our buyer representation agreement. And then we have a single party compensation agreement. And now we have a compensation agreement as well. So this would be like, hey, like I'm not representing you or whatever, but there's still compensation agreed in place. So it wouldn't be under an agency disclosure, but it would just be, hey, yeah, if you find me a buyer, like you're not my agent, but if you find me a buyer, I'll compensate you. Okay, type thing. They just add for entity principals. So the same thing we've seen on several of the other forms where they've updated this for a non-individual entity principal. So somebody who's a trust, corporation, LLC, probate, partnership, holding power of attorney or other entity. Okay, the full name of the entity, the contractual identity principal, and then who is the legally authorized signer. Okay, so that was really the only change to that one. Like I can just close out of that from there. I don't know why it keeps pumping this up, but that's all right. The next one is the single party compensation. So this is in a transaction where maybe you don't represent the seller. So maybe you have a buyer that you have a BRBC in place with, and the seller says, yeah, you're not going to represent me, but you could pay or whatever, whatever. So it's single party. So you're only one party is compensating. This is principal agrees to pay broker irrespective of agency relationships percentage. Okay. We can go back over these. You can also search my YouTube channel for where we talked about all these forms and how to utilize the different ones. The only change here is, again, on the end, they just added that entity sellers there, or entity principals. It's a principal. It could be a buyer or a seller. Okay, so they just added that in. That's the only change to that. For the most part, you're not going to see the compensation agreement or the single compensation agreement. For the most part, you're going to have either a listing agreement in place or a BRBC in place. Okay, and then you're going to get compensated that way. Okay, so we aren't usually going to have to worry about it, but just in case you do, that's the changes. All right, the next one is our SNA form. I'm just figuring out how to make it bigger. That's our non-agency agreement. So this would be our seller non-agency agreement. And they just made a change down here at the bottom. I'm blowing it up for you guys. Just says that, hey, broker compensation, broker either directly or through ESCO will receive compensation in the transaction as follows: from the seller or housing provider pursuant to a separate written agreement between seller and housing provider and broker, or from the buyer or tenant pursuant to a separate written agreement between buyer and broker. The obligations under any agreement indicated here may be altered through the purchase agreement or other separate agreements. Okay, so this is usually like, hey, seller, a non-agency, we've got, your name, we've got the property address, we've got the parcel number, it's situated in what county, here's the buyer's name, they're contemplating on making an offer to purchase. So this isn't, hey, they've made an offer. This is, hey, they're thinking about making an offer on your property. This would be where the seller doesn't have a listing agreement. Okay, there's no listing agreement. They don't want to list the property with you. Maybe you wrote like a golden letter and they're like, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do want to sell my property. Yes, I'm willing to pay a commission, right? Whatever it might be. So it's just saying that, hey, here's the buyer. I've got a legit buyer. If this buyer makes an offer on your property, will you pay me, right? So this is where it's going to be paid for seller or buyer. So the seller might agree to it or the buyer might have agreed to it. But it also says that, hey, once that offer is actually made, this can be overridden. So whatever in that offer is what goes. Okay, so that's all it's saying down here. Any questions about this SNA form? You're probably going to see this very little. Very little. Okay. So many options for forms in our car forms library. The next one is, oh, this one's really cool. Actually, this is our seller multiple offer summary of multiple offers, the sum-mo, SUM-MO, summary of multiple offers. They just updated this. Form's always existed. You've probably never seen it. We have our own little spreadsheet that we use, which I probably need to update my spreadsheet for sure. But here it's got the terms. So it added seller payment for buyer closing costs or additional seller credit items or buyer's brokerage fee. So that's where you put the compensation, additional seller credit terms, or buyer's closing costs. Net price before seller's costs and expenses. So you would take the purchase price minus this and put that number there. Okay. So it's just giving it a straight across starting point minus the concessions that are going to be paid back to the buyer or buyer's broker. Okay. And then it's got the regular stuff in here. It did add in investigation because it probably said inspection contingency, but it's actually an investigation contingency and insurance. So they added both of those in there. on that section. Any questions on the summary of multiple offers? All right. None of these forms are like, these changes are not, earth shattering by any means, except for that removal of the SPBB, which is a win for sure. Okay. We're going to start at the beginning of this one here. Let me blow it up a little bit. This is our residential listing agreement. Remember, at Realty One Group, we're going to use the residential listing agreement, exclusive authorization and right to sell. They did make all these changes on all of the listing agreements. There's non-exclusive. There's 3 or 4 different listing agreements, but they just said, instead of attached compensation schedule, it now says attached broker created compensation schedule. It's got that additional compensation down here. See attached broker created. And then if broker represents both buyer and seller, buyer side compensation shall be specified in a separate written agreement between the broker and the buyer. So it's just saying, hey, it's between them, not us. Okay, so super simple changes there. Here is E2. Is the publication of seller willingness to consider concessions. If checked below, seller authorizes broker to market that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions. And so that's the default if it's checked. It says if checked below. We'll come back to that statement in a minute. No amount of the possible concession will be stated in such marketing unless seller notifies broker in writing of the amount. In the first box is in the MLS listed above, if permitted by that MLS, or in any other marketing outside the MLS. So ultimately, what I would do if I was filling out this listing agreement, I'm going to check both of those boxes. Even though we can't put it in the MLS, I'm going to check that box anyways. And I'm also going to check the box in any other marketing outside the MLS. That means that, hey, if somebody calls, or, I can put on a flyer, seller willing to pay concessions. Now, notice it says that the seller authorizes the broker to market that the seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions, and no amount of the possible concession will be stated in such marketing. So we're not going to say, unless we have it in writing from the seller, we're not going to say seller willing to pay 2% concessions. We're just going to put seller willing to pay concessions. Okay, so unless you have it in writing, the amount of concessions that the seller's willing to pay, and they want you to market that. Everybody make sense there on E2 of the listing grid?
I have a question.
Yes.
How come Metro List has their own rules? Like I had put on one of my listings that that there was a contractor box, or I'd put something. And they were like, that violates our rules. You have to change that. And then I put about the concession too in the private comments.
So the MLSs are all independently owned and operated. MetroList MLS is owned by the Sacramento Association of Realtors. It's owned by the association. So it has strict guidelines that it has to adhere to, and that they've agreed to as part of their laws and bylaws. Things like you can't mention contractors boxes in the private remarks, because technically all properties in MetroList are supposed to have a MetroList box on them. Okay. Things like no coming soons, right, in MetroList, because it's owned by the Association of Realtors, which has to adhere to the National Association of Realtors rules and guidelines. So they are stricter up in MetroList, I think, than almost anywhere else, but it's because it's owned by the association. Most of the MLSs around us are owned by the association. Barry's MLS, which I think we're going to see more of as time progresses, Barry's MLS is owned by a separate entity. It's owned by agents. Okay, so it's not owned by the Northern Solano Association of Realtors, or it's not owned by the Southern Solano Association of Realtors. We are not a realtor-owned MLS, so we have less strict guidelines like the coming soon. We don't have to adhere to the National Association of Realtors clear cooperation policy, and we don't. So we have coming soon listings, but that's why it's different. Even though we have Barry's Plus, which shares information between like 9 MLSs, if the property's primarily being listed in one of the specific MLSs, you have to adhere to the rules of that specific MLS. Did that answer your question, Anastasia?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, plugging right along here on this listing agreement. I don't think we have very many other changes until the end, but let's just double check. They had to renumber everything because they messed up the numbers. So now you've got new. All right, here we go. Seller concessions right here, section 10. Remember, we talked about this in the the purchase agreement. Concessions are monetary payments that a seller agrees to contribute towards a buyer's expenses and other costs the buyer is responsible for in the transaction. Concessions may include, but are not limited to, cost of escrow, title, lender fees, repairs, inspections, and buyer broker compensation. Concessions specified in the MLS must be allowed to be used for any permissible buyer expense or cost and must not specify the concessions are to be used for broker compensation. However, a term in the buyer's offer may specify that the seller agrees to pay all or a portion of the compensation that the buyer owes its broker. Concessions identified in an MLS listing are not a promise to pay, but instead indicate to a buyer that the seller will consider offers asking for concessions. Concessions specified in the MLS are not intended to be binding on seller unless included in the accepted purchase agreement. So it's just clarifying that information there under the seller concessions. All right, and then we've got some renumbers that have gone on. And then again, that section for the entity sellers have been completely updated on that listing agreement. Any questions about the listing agreement?
So there's a place on the, sorry, I jumped on late, my computer issues, but so there's a place on the RPA that says seller concessions, or is that like towards the very top, like right before you put the purchase amount?
Yep, nope. Down on the purchase agreement now, in the section, I think it's under G, section G, I think is where it's at. It has a seller concession line item. It has seller concession additional terms, and then it has seller's payment to buyer's broker. So where we used to have to use the SPBB form come Tuesday, we won't have to use the SPBB form anymore, that seller's payment to buyer's broker. We can just put it right onto the purchase agreement.
Got it. That's what you were saying. That
Yep.
changed and you don't need the SPBB. Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Thank you.
No problems. All right, the next form where there was changes is the MLSA. That's our multiple listing service addendum. So I'm just trying to figure out how to blow it up for you guys. There was a couple changes there. Remember, this form was new in July. They rolled it out in July. And it just talks about the benefits of using the MLS, impact of opting out of the MLS. It just talks about here that real estate agents, brokers, members of the public may be unaware of the terms and conditions under which the seller is marketing the property, and the scope of marketing will consist only of direct one-on-one promotion between brokers and licensees affiliated with the listing brokerage and their respective clients. So that's just talking about the impact of opting out of the MLS, that we can do one-on-one promotion between us and our licensees affiliated with that listing, but that we can't, if it's not in the MLS, we may not be able to market it to all the agents. Public marketing of the property, clear cooperation policy. Oh, it skipped. Come back. Okay, right there. Unless 3F is checked, that exclusive seller and reserved listings for residential real property with 1 to 4 units and vacant lots be submitted to the MLS within 1 business day of any public marketing. This is because the MLSs have adopted the clear cooperation policy of the National Association of Realtors. That's what I was just talking about. The policy that seeks to maximize seller profits by highlighting the importance of advertising listed properties in forums that are ultimately visible to the public. So it's just saying, hey, unless 3F is checked, then we have to adhere to the clear cooperation policy. 3F is on the next page, which would be right here, that the clear cooperation policy does not apply. So again, if it's listed in the Berry service area, that would be Solano, Napa, Sonoma, Marin, and Mendocino counties. You could check box F right there that the clear cooperation does not apply. we can market that property to the public, even if it's not in the MLS. So there's that form there on the, hold on. I keep moving you guys around my screen, the little pictures of you. Now I can't get you moved. There we go. All right, that's the MLSA, or the multiple listing service addendum. That goes, it attaches automatically to your listing agreement, just for the record. All right, the next one is the modification of terms for the listing agreement. This is going to be used either for listings or property management agreement. So we have listing agreement or a box for other there in case it was a property management agreement. It updated from seller to principal. Not a big deal there. Same thing at the bottom. It updated from seller to principal. So super minor changes on that modification of terms form. Then we have our seller contingency removal. So this is our CR-S. It just says that, hey, seller's removal of contingencies. Seller hereby removes the following seller contingency: the finding of replacement property. You've got closing of replacement property or other. And here is that close of escrow extension. So on our sellers, seller hereby removes these on the SPRP form, the seller's purchase of replacement property is right there. I didn't even have to come up with it on my own. It has that once the seller enters into contract, when they serve notice that they're removing the contingency of finding the replacement property, that they can extend the close of escrow up to blank days. Okay, that's on the SPRP. This is now giving you that option that, hey, we're removing our finding replacement property contingency, and we're going to extend that close of escrow as permitted on the SPRP form. So you have to fill out that section on the SPRP form. What that does is it allows us to match up the sale of the seller's property with the closing of their new property, so they aren't homeless for 2 weeks in the middle. So you would fill out this section here. Seller elects to extend the close of escrow date for the sale of seller's property for X additional days or until a specific date. If paragraph 2C of CAR form SPRP does not allow for such extension, this notice of extension shall be deemed invalid and shall have no effect on the agreement. So it has to be written into the SPRP for this section to be valid. Any questions on that change to the seller contingency removal form? All righty. The next one is the TDS. So that's the transfer disclosure statement. Right? You've got 3 pages here of the TDS. They just changed it to agent, broker representing the seller, or agent, broker obtaining the offer. They clarified it there because I think this was one of the last ones that still had the agent's name on there, and it said like listing agent and then selling agent. So it was a little bit confusing. So they've now updated it to broker representing the seller, broker obtaining the offer, buyer and seller's names get signed down here, agent here. They updated that as well to just match up above. Now keep in mind that if, well, it's not gonna matter. All right, there you go. That's it all gets signed. There's your transfer disclosure statement. Any questions on that change? The next one is our seller property questionnaire, our SPQ form. And they're on section 6K. Let's see if I can blow this up for you. Hold on. Blow it up. Oh, that's a little big. Let's fit it on the screen. All right. It just says, any inspection reports on the exterior balconies, stairways, or other elevated elements on buildings with 3 or more units of the on the property prepared in the last 6 years or 9 years for condominiums, yes or no. And then it just says C CAR form WSB. Whoa. CAR form WBSA for more information. So that was that wood balconies stairs addendum that we covered earlier today that had some changes to it. So it's just saying, hey, reference that form. All right, here is a new section in 9B, disaster relief insurance or civil settlements. They've added 9B, receiving domestic water shortage tank assistance pursuant to 13194 of the Water Code, or whether a real property ever received such assistance and the real property currently still has a domestic storage tank, yes or no? Okay, if yes, the following disclosure is made. This property has a domestic water storage tank provided by county, community water system, local public agency, or nonprofit organization pursuant to 13194 of the Water Code. The domestic well storage tank was made available to households that had a private well that had gone dry or had been destroyed due to drought, wildfire, or other natural disasters, or was otherwise non-functioning. The domestic water shortage tank provided pursuant to 13194 of the Water Code may not convey with the real property due to water well issues that led to this property obtaining assistance pursuant to 13194 of the Water Code. The buyer is advised to have an inspection of the water well and have a professional evaluation of the availability of water to the property to ensure that it suits the purposes for which the buyer is purchasing the property. So just be aware of this if it's got a water storage tank on the premises provided by a agency of some sort. And this is on that seller property questionnaire. So this is for the seller to fill out and answer. Any questions about that one there, that 9B? All right, moving right along on our seller property questionnaire. Maybe. One, two, three. Hold on, we're just trying to get to 4. You can do it. No, it can't. There is no page 4. It's just the signature page. There weren't any changes to the last page. I don't know why it's not showing up, but maybe it doesn't actually exist. Oh, let's not close that whole window. The next one is the square footage and lot size addendum, or advisory, sorry, and disclosure. So it just says here, they added as applicable and then structure size. So, right, so it just says here measurements. Let me blow it up for you guys. Measurements of structures vary from source to source, and that data is often contradictory. There is no one official size source or a standard method for calculating exterior structural size or interior space or square footage. Buyers should not rely on any advertised or disclosed square foot measurements and should retain their own experts to measure as applicable structure size and square footage during their investigation period. Okay, then it added such calculation should not be relied upon by the buyer. And then down here, property size, existing structures or amenities may not be located within the actual property. So they just added existing. So those are the only changes to that form. Super simple. They just added some clarifying words. It's always nice.
I have a question.
Yep.
So you know how whenever you're inputting a listing, it'll take the square footage from the MLS or from somewhere else. So like, let's say you added in whatever square footage, 2,000 square feet on a home. When you go to the MLS page and you see the square footage, the lot size, and so forth, is that what they input, or would it say something else if they inputted it versus like the MLS?
Yeah. So when you input that square foot and lot size, which generally speaking, it auto-populates from tax records. So it asks you on the MLS where that was provided by, if it was tax records or if it was seller provided. So you could put it in there. So if you go in there and edit it, you may just want to make sure that the seller fills out this form, because see here, it's got a line item for seller square footage, what the public record says, what the MLS says, like a previous listing. Like the house that I sold last had like 3 or 4 different varying square footages in the MLS, and then maybe what the seller's saying, and then you would say measurement comes from the following source, and it'd be like, you know, contractor at time of remodel or whatever that is, and then the seller would fill that information out. So I'd make sure they put it in there, and then I would probably, if it varies from what the tax records show and I altered that in the private remarks, I would make sure just to make a little comment there that square footage is based on seller's disclosure or something like that. Please see the SFLS form.
So on the MLS, when you're actually looking at the lot size and just the regular size square footage of a home, that number there depends on what somebody inputted on the MLS?
No,
Whether it was,
that one generally auto-populates from tax records.
okay. I'm just wondering, like, should I be taking a look at that extra carefully if somebody were to input that part versus, it automatically auto-populating.
Yeah, it should be marked if it wasn't pulled over from the tax records. It should be marked. And you can always double check it with tax records. Like if it's something the buyer's getting ready to make an offer on, just click on the APN number and make sure that it matches what it says in the MLS is the best way to disclose and figure that out.
And why would somebody ask like a brokerage or like their TC ask for this to be filled out if it just for their records? Because I had a transaction that they were like, can you fill this out? And I've never seen it before. So I'm like, what does she need this for? And then I'm like, it says it on the MLS, but maybe because she was an out-of-town agent and she didn't have access to our MLS, maybe she wanted that on there.
So I always have my sellers fill out this form. And as a buyer, even if the seller hasn't provided it, I will ask for it, generally speaking, or I will fill it out for the buyer. Mainly because, or just leave it blank and have my buyer sign it, because it's not required for the seller to provide it. But part of the reason is that it talks about at the top the information on different sources of square foot measurements. If this is important to you, make sure to do your own investigation, buyer. Like if the square footage, you're like, I'm not going to buy a house less than 1,500 feet, square feet, and this is 1,505. Like, hey, do your own due diligence. Make sure it meets your requirements, right? That I'm not responsible for that. So it just talks about that. So that's why I like this form. If the seller fills it out, then they put in here. If I fill it out, oftentimes I'll take what's in the public record or the multiple listing service and list it on there, and then also attach a copy of that tax form or whatever that shows the square footage. And then down here under the buyer signature, it's just signing below. Buyer acknowledges that buyer read, understand, and received a copy of the square footage and lot size advisory and disclosure. Buyer is encouraged to read it carefully. If no information is provided, so right, if the seller didn't provide information, we can leave this blank and just have the buyer sign this form, right? So if no information is provided and or any of the measurements are material to the buyer, right? They're important to the buyer. Buyer is strongly advised to investigate the validity, accuracy, or existence of any measurements provided herein or otherwise. If buyer does not do so, they are acting against the advice of the brokers and agents. I like this form just because to me, it's very clear that, hey, buyer, make sure you're happy with the square foot and the lot size of this property. I'm removing myself from that decision.
All right, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. And for the seller's point of view, it's like, hey, I'm just disclosing, like, this is what's on public record. This is what's showing up on the MLS. Then if the seller has a discrepancy, they can put it in there or, whatever it might be. So I like this form. That's your square footage and lot size advisory and disclosure. All right, our next form is our SIP form, our seller in possession after the close of escrow. This form is used up to 29 days post close of escrow if they're going to remain in the property longer than 29 days, so 30 days or more. Then we would use the RLAS, or the residential lease after sale. This one just had a small change down here on entry. It just says seller shall make property available to buyer for the purpose of necessary repairs and services include, but are not limited to, repairs and services required by buyer's lender or insurer. So that should be, entry should be provided for that. So it talks about, just so you know, it talks about making necessary agreed to repairs or supplied necessary agreed to services, or to show property to prospective or actual purchasers, tenant, mortgagees, lenders, appraisers, contractors. So remember, this is seller remaining in the property after close of escrow. Sometimes there might be repairs that are required. There's an escrow holdback or something for those repairs to be completed. And it's been, the buyer's lender often requires like 30 or 60 days to complete those repairs and show proof. So this would allow the buyer to be able to send their repair people in to make those repairs. Any questions about that form change on the seller in possession, the SIP form? All right, our next one is our LPD. That's our lead-based paint disclosure and hazards, or hazards and disclosure acknowledgement and addendum. it just states that, hey, on section B, well, up here on section A, right, that lessors must disclose the presence of, before renting of known lead-based paint. So, right, it's just saying, hey, we're clarifying that they have to know about it. If they don't know about it, they can't disclose it. Down here on section 1B, it just says, hey, we have no records or reports pertaining to lead-based paint and our lead-based paint hazards, right? Semantics, we're just clarifying that it's not just reports, it's records or reports. So that was the clarification there. And then at the end, we put seller or housing providers, because this could be completed by either the seller or landlord. So it just clarified seller or housing provider there. Tenants acknowledgement. We have received copies of all records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the housing listed in paragraph 1 above. If initialed, I have not received any records or reports regarding lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. So if they haven't gotten anything, they would initial there. I have received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family, and then they just renumbered everything else. So, and then it renamed it buyers or tenants down here instead of just buyers. Any questions about the changes on that lead-based paint form? Again, these are all really minor changes so far. All right, the next one is
question. Sorry, took me a while to unmute it. Okay, so this is for the seller. Does this normally populate on any of our other forms together? Or, I mean, I guess it just depends if you put it in your package, right?
Yeah, this is one of those forms that we usually send out through Glide with our disclosures, because the seller has to answer questions and sign it. And it's only for properties built before 1978. If the property was built before 1978, this form is not required.
Okay, I gotta send that to my client.
And again, you can send it through Glide, and then it'll ask them the questions individually and fill it out.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right. The next one is the Fair Housing Disclosure Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. They just made 2 little changes. One is it says race and race traits. Okay, so race or race traits. And then down here at the bottom, any arbitrary characteristic or intersectionality. So we're just further clarifying that don't discriminate in real estate. Okay, that was the only change there on that Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. Whew. The next one is our disclosure and modification to the listing agreement. So this is what we use to modify that listing agreement. We use a different form. It's the DM-BR for the buyer representation form, but the DM-LA is for listing agreements. Oh, no, I lied. This is only for listings that were signed prior to July of 2024. That's when the last forms were revised and sent out. So they just used intended use for listings revised before 7/24. That's the only time you'd ever use this form. That's the only change that was made. I was going to skip it, but I got sucked into it. So there you go. Because most of our listings are now signed after that date. Although I do still have one that I need that signed for. But anyways, moving on to our next form. This was the quick release. All right, there we go. All right, we have our buyer financial and personal information form. This, the BFPI form, this is now used in conjunction with the residential purchase agreement. And this just says that, hey, without buyer's permission, we're not disclosing any financial or personal information identified on this form to the seller. Okay, before it was, hey, we're not disclosing it, but now it says without buyer's permission. So if the buyer gives them permission to be able to do that, like maybe the buyer says, hey, let the seller know that I don't have money to pay your commission. And if they aren't willing to pay, then I'm not going to purchase this house. Now we can disclose it. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. That was the only change to this form here, the BFPI form. The next one is going to be the buyer identification of preferences and priorities. So remember, this also can be used in conjunction with the BRBC. I do recommend that you have them fill it out, or that you fill it out with them, so that you have all their preferences and priorities. This also allows them to very clearly state, because I was part of a lawsuit where they said I wasn't looking out for their best interests, what they're looking for, and it allows them to sign and acknowledge what it said that they were looking for. So this is a great form to use. Protect yourself. it just says here, the buyer read, understand, and received a copy of the buyer identification of, right? So they just added buyer there. And then down here, it just acknowledge and receipt copy of this buyer identification of preferences and priorities. So that would be our signature, buyer signs above. Okay, any questions on those two forms?
How often would we use that?
This one I would use every time I have a new buyer, or if we've had conversations and what their preferences and priorities after looking at 4, 5, or 6, or 10 properties, they realize they've kind of changed a little bit. You might come back and say, hey, okay, so we originally talked about this price range, but now you're saying that we can bump it up to this, right? Or maybe originally you said 3-bedroom, but now you're looking for a 4-bedroom, or you've decided you don't want it in this location. You could fill that out on number 2 or 3, or just come back and cross it out, put the new information, and have them initial it. That way you just have it on record, what that is. I don't think this is something you have to revisit every time you go look at properties by any means, but if there's been substantial changes, you may just want to revisit it. It's not a required form by any means. And so you can kind of be loosey-goosey. It's more of a like a CYA, like, right, protect yourself type form, and so that you can meet the needs of those buyers.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome. All right. The next one is there's the 2 open house forms that are here. One is the property visit and open house advisory. And this just talks about this one. Okay. It's not a new form. I think we've talked about it one other time ever in my history of being a agent or broker. This is the second time. So as I'm saying this, I'm going to give you guys advice that, hey, use this form in conjunction with your BRBC. Okay, with your buyer representation agreement, use this property visit and open house advisory, the PVOH. Number 1, risks of visiting and viewing properties. You might be recorded. Now we've disclosed that, hey, at any property, you could be recorded. Whether you visit a property that is being offered for sale, it is whenever you visit a property that is being offered to sale, it's always possible that you are being recorded. Sellers sometimes set up cameras and other recording devices at their properties, both inside and outside of the main dwelling and other structures. Often, sellers do so for security and other reasons. Some sellers post warning signs to visitors about such recording devices. You're supposed to, but most of us don't. But other sellers do not. You guys should all make cute little frames with a warning that you can put on every single listing because it should be on there. But other sellers do not. Some sellers do not even fully understand the types of data the recording devices are able to collect, right? If you've got like an Alexa or something, like you're not even thinking about it as a recording device, but technically it is. Such as sound, images, and videos. If you wish to have private conversations amongst yourself or with your agent about topics such as your favorite property features, your negotiating strategy, or the highest price you are willing to pay for a property, you are advised to save such discussions for after you have left the seller's property entirely. Because the seller's devices may be capable of recording your conduct, conversation, movements, and statements, keep in mind when you are visiting any seller's property, it is always possible you are being recorded. Dun, dun, dun. So great form to use before you go see any properties. It also talks about visitor safety, that you're watchful of conditions on the property. It talks about animals and pets, children and minor, risks of injuries. It's a great form. Use this form. It's the PVOH. Make a note. Put it with your BRBC every time you use it. PVOH.
What I did was I printed this up and I put it in a acrylic stand. And when they're signing in on the open house form, this is right next to it.
Nice.
Is that okay, or do they have to sign it?
This one doesn't have to be signed. This one I would utilize with my BRBC. There's a separate there's the separate open house, the Ohana form is what I call it, the OHOA. Yeah. That I think that's sufficient as long as you're putting it there. You may want to add a little line caveat on your sign up that they have also read and acknowledged the open house advisory form, the other one.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
This one's totally optional. I would just have all of my buyers sign it so that they're aware. They can't say I didn't tell them. All right. Let me see if I can find that other form.
Not for each individual property that you show, right? Just, you're gonna show them 5 properties today, have them sign it for that day.
For that one, I would just say, hey, we're agreeing that you're gonna work with me as I'm gonna be your buyer's agent. Sign this form one time.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, not even every time I go show properties, just once. I was looking for that. Oh, maybe that's it. There we go. The open house, visitor, non-agency disclosure and sign-in. This one should be present at every open house that you do. Like Anastasia said, I would never actually have them sign on, at least not the number of people sign here. So I would do one of these for each group of people that come through my open house. That way they're more likely to put accurate information on here. Or like Anastasia said, she post this in a nice little frame next to the sign in. I would just make sure on that sign in sheet where they're signing or putting their information that they have read and reviewed the open house visitor non-agency disclosure. You could even like print up a little copy with the sign up sheets. They could take it with them. I don't know. Make it fun, but yeah, having it next to it and with a signature acknowledging it, it doesn't have to be on this form, it could be on your regular sign in will work. They just updated this, that this can be used for open house or individual private showings. So maybe you're meeting with a Zillow person who hasn't signed an agency agreement yet, then we could do this. Or, you know, like sometimes we, you know, we have these wonderful out of area agents that we love so much. And they're like, I can't make it to see your listing. Are you having any open houses? And you're like, no, no more. And they're like, oh, my buyer really wanted to see it. Do you mind opening it for them? I'd be like, sure, but they've got to fill this out and sign it stating that I am not representing them. So anybody who you're going to go show properties to that you're not representing, I would have sign this form. Okay, there you go. So this can be used for open house or any individual private showings. The open house, visitor, non-agency disclosure, and sign in the Ohana form. All right. The next one is our property showing. This is our temporary buyer representation agreement. So this is our PSRA form. It says very clearly on the top now, this is intended for use with a limited number of properties only and non-exclusive only, which means that if we've signed this and the buyer goes and sees another property with another agent, even though we have this in effect, we aren't due a commission if they write an offer on that other property. This is only for up to 3 properties. And just the properties that we actually showed them. Okay. And it's not to exceed 30 days. So it's 3 properties or 30 days. Okay. See attached list of properties. You shouldn't need an attached list because there's only supposed to be 3. Although it doesn't say that now. It just says limited number. I was just looking if it clarified. So it could be like a few more. It could be like the first showing because I don't see where it says 3 properties anymore. It used to very clearly have 3 properties. They removed that from the form. So it's not to exceed 30 days and limited number of properties, non-exclusive. So I wouldn't want to use this only because it's non-exclusive, but if you're going to go meet with a client for the first time or a potential client for the first time, maybe they're Zillow, they want to go see 5 properties, you could use this, just use the attached list of properties because it no longer clarifies 5, it just says limited number. Okay, you've got the attached broker created compensation schedule, continued right for payment for broker involved property. The continuation period shall be blank calendar days after the representation period or any extension thereof. Okay, fill in a number there, 30, 60, 90. That just says that, hey, we've expired the properties I showed you. If you write an offer on those for this X number of days after the expiration, it's still valid. Okay, you can't wait for this to expire and then turn around and go write an offer on one of those properties. That's what it's there to protect you from. All right, let's see here. Continuation of right for compensation for broker involved properties. Broker shall be entitled to the compensation. This is what we were just talking for in paragraph 4B1 if during the continuation period specified in 4B3. Buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property for which there was broker involvement. The timing of such payment is subject to the terms of paragraph 5D. Broker's right to compensation pursuant to this paragraph shall only apply if prior to the expiration of this agreement or any extension, broker delivers buyer a written notice of those properties for which there was broker involvement. So make sure if this expires that you serve them that, and they're not gonna, you don't sign a regular BRBC, that you make sure you give them a copy of the NBIP, the notice of broker involved properties. Timing and compensation didn't change. This is the numbers. We've got cancellation of representation agreement. Broker shall be entitled to compensation if during the representation period or the continuation period specified in paragraph 4B3, prospective buyers enters into contract to acquire property for which there was broker involvement. And they just said, hey, timing of such payment is subject to terms of 5D, which is basically the close of escrow or upon legal suit. Okay, any questions about that PSRA, those changes that were made there? They just added that continuation period.
No, ma'am.
All right, for the most part, we should be using the BRBC. We only use that when we have to for temporary use. Next is our cancellation of buyer representation form. They did update this form, which was probably a good update. I appreciate this. It's just notice of cancellation of buyer representation. They added notice there. And then they added unilateral cancellation. They included options for cancellation. So this is, hey, 1A is the buyer representation agreement is for non-exclusive representation. The cancellation is effective immediately. Okay, so that's one is, hey, we're agreeing, but it was non-exclusive and it's effective immediately. 1B is the buyer representation agreement was for exclusive representation. So the cancellation is effective 30 days after receipt of this notice. It could be less depending on what you put on the BRBC. That's one of those things that you can fill in. It can be 30 days or less, but the default's 30 days. Okay, so that's unilateral. That's one person canceling the agreement. Or you could do B2, which is mutual cancellation. Regardless of the type of representation, buyer and broker agree to mutually cancel the buyer representation immediately upon or blank days after the last signature in the mutual cancellation box. Scope of cancellation. Cancellation notice applies to all properties that may be subject to the buyer representation, or it only applies for the following property. So if single property versus all of them. Buyer representation agreement remains in effect for all other properties covered by this agreement. If checked, this unilateral cancellation is provided because the seller of the property identified in paragraph 2C above has declined to pay all of broker's compensation due from buyer, and buyer has represented that buyer lacks the ability to pay broker. Broker withdraws from representing buyer for the property identified in 2C3. C form, CAR form, CAC for further information. So that's saying, hey, like, right. So we have the BRBC and the financial information, and it talks about that, hey, the buyer doesn't have the means. So if the seller doesn't agree to pay the buyer's compensation and they're unwilling to pay you compensation, you can cancel the agreement for that property only, which means you're not going to represent them in the purchase of that property. They're not going to pay you a commission if they purchase that property, which means you're now done. You can walk away. But if they end up not purchasing that property and they turn around and make an offer on another property for which you were involved, or if you have the exclusive agreement, then you would still be due a commission. That's why we would say only one property. So that's how you would utilize that C2. Okay, and it'd be C2B. You'd want to check 2 and B for that. Okay, agency, they just highlighted that there and called it agency. Compensation due to broker, if applicable during the continuation period specified in the applicable buyer representation agreement. Compensation shall be paid as specified in the paragraphs below 2E, 2A, B, C, or D, if both parties agree by signing in the mutual cancellation box below. So this would be, hey, buyer agrees to pay broker X number of dollars for actual expenses incurred. That'd be A. B is broker to receive a referral fee. Broker will receive a referral fee from another broker pursuant to a separate written agreement. So maybe they decide to purchase outside of your purchase zone or another agent, and they said, yeah, but we'll pay you we want to use this one, but we'll pay you a referral fee. No compensation is C, and then D is other. Any questions about this cancellation form so far? All right, page 2 just says, here is buyer and broker mutual cancellation box. That is what we would sign if we had mutual cancellation. If it's a unilateral cancellation, so one party is canceling, the party specified in 2A hereby gives notice of cancellation to the other party under the terms of this cancellation of buyer representation. Buyer, whoever's doing the canceling, signs here. The other party can initial here, saying that, hey, we received it. It's not going to be required though. It would still be canceled as long as they're within their rights under the BRBC or the PSRA. All right, any questions there before we move on? That's the cancellation of buyer representation form, the COBRA form. All right, here is the estimated, this is a new form. Actually, I don't think it's a new form. I think it came out in December, but no, that's right. This is December. This is a new form. I've never seen it before, at least. Estimated compensation costs for sellers, scenarios 1 and 2, right? So this form is a tool to explain the net proceeds the seller will receive after considering different methods for compensating a buyer's broker. In all scenarios, seller agrees in the listing to pay the seller's brokerage. Scenarios 1 and 2, seller also agrees in a purchase agreement or separate agreement to pay the buyer's broker out of the seller proceeds from the sale, the amount specified, which could be a flat fee or a % of the purchase price. Could be all sum of the amount that buyer owes their own broker. Scenario 3, seller does not agree to pay any compensation to buyer's broker. Buyer's agent agrees to pay their own broker. For full breakdown of all costs of sale, including closing costs, concessions, loan payoffs, see CAR form ESP or estimated seller proceeds. So here's where you would put, hey, here's the estimated purchase price. Here's the payment to the seller's brokerage, to the buyer's brokerage. That'd be their own buyers, own buyers. This is, maybe this is like X %. This would be Y %. So you'd bring 2 different scenarios. And this is, hey, you're not paying any. Here's scenario 1, 2, and 3 for a second purchase price. So you could, pre-fill this out, give them an idea of what that would look like for each purchase price. Okay. Any questions about the estimated compensation costs for sellers? Just a good way to break down for sellers that maybe are having questions. It's also a good one to show like the difference generally in like a 0.5% isn't that big. And so it might be like, this might make the difference for this buyer deciding to move forward or not. And for you, this is what it looks like on paper. It's not that big a deal. So it's a good way to just visually show them that. All right, we have our modification of terms of the buyer's representation agreement, the MT-BR. So this is what we would utilize to modify that BRBC or the PSRA. And they just clarified up here that, hey, it's the buyer representation agreement. They clarified it could be either form, or it could be a tenant representation agreement, the form TRBC or other. You're gonna put dates, times, right? Expiration of the representation agreement. They just changed the wording a little bit to be more inclusive. Any renewal of buyer representation agreement may not last longer than 3 months from the date of this modification unless principal is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. If the renewal of a buyer representation agreement exceeds 3 months, the modification is void unless principal is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. Like, notice it says to 3 months, not 90 days. Right? Because sometimes months are longer than 30 days. So that sets you up that if we signed this today, then we could, 3 months would be January, February, March. It could be March 13th. We don't have to count actual days. It's just 3 full months. So there's the win there. This modification to the compensation shall only apply to the following properties. So remember when earlier I talked about like if you were going to modify the compensation that you may want to make it property specific. They now have a little checkbox and you could fill in that address there. So it doesn't modify the entire agreement just if they close on a single specific property. You could change the property type that you're willing to show. You can change the location of that BRBC and you can change it from non-exclusive to exclusive representation. That's what you can do with the modification terms. There's also an other line, so anything else in that agreement can be updated there. And then they would sign and you would sign. Any questions about that modification of terms to the buyer representation agreement? All right. Our next form is the estimated compensation cost for buyers. This is like the estimated compensation cost for sellers, except this is the buyer version of it. Again, this is a newer form. It's just to show them different scenarios and what that would look for. So for a full breakdown of all costs, including closing costs, see car form EBC, the estimated buyer cost. We're just going to say, hey, at this purchase price, here's what the compensation is in the BRBC. Here's the buyer's broker's compensation paid by seller. Here's the compensation paid by buyer. And then you've got a couple different purchase prices. You can work that out. Scenario 1 is seller pays buyer's broker in full. Scenario 2 would be seller pays buyer's broker in part, right? Just part of what's due. And then 3 is seller does not pay buyer's broker. Buyers pay buyer's broker entirely. So it just gives you some different scenarios you can work out and show them in case they need a visual example of what that looks like. Any questions about that form, the estimated compensation costs? All righty. I think we have one more form and then we are done. This is our BRBC form, of the buyer representation and broker compensation form. I don't believe there were any major changes on here, but my brain's all mush now, so who knows? But the default here on the grid on B1, 2B1 is single family residence. There was no way to eliminate single family residence. So now there's a checkbox that's going to be there in case they're not looking at single family residences. They're only looking at multifamily or industrial or vacant land. So you can update that. You've got the same update to the broker created compensation schedule instead of just the attached compensation schedule. You've got cancellation effective 30 days after receipt for the cancellation right of the exclusive agency, or you can change that, but it can't exceed 30 days. So it could be 20 days, 15 days. You could leave it at 30. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay buyer. Broker. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. You would check this box. Buyer's broker's obligation to represent buyer in a transaction is contingent upon a seller's agreement to pay the amount of compensation specified in paragraph 2E1. They're just clarifying that. They just reworded it. Here is the continuation of compensation for broker involved properties, that it just says the timing of such payment is issued, is subject to paragraph 4D. So nothing major there. Here in the cancellation of buyer representation, it just talks about that anybody can give notice at any time to cancel this. But the broker shall still be entitled to compensation if during the representation period or the continuation period specified in paragraph 2E3, buyer enters into contract to acquire property for which there was broker involvement, provided broker delivers to buyer a written list of those properties for which there was broker involvement. The written list of broker involvement properties shall be delivered to buyer within 5 calendar days after the effective date of the cancellation. The timing of such payment is subject to terms of paragraph 4D. Let's see here. That's it there. And then box 5, it just allows you to have, they've rewritten the buyer entities to match all the other buyer entities that we've talked about today. And then cancellation, either buyer or broker may unilaterally cancel this agreement by giving 30 days written notice, or, oh, this is if it's exclusive representation, or as otherwise specified in paragraph 2F. So that's the only other change there. And that brings us to the end of our forms update. If you want to look over these changes or know where to find them, if you log into your car library, let's see if I can find a page, that one will, that will take me to my car forms library. You go to car.org. The fastest way to get there is if you have the little red line right here. Car releases forward-looking forms. I think this will take you there. Let's try it. Usually it does. Let's see. Those are all, no, that's a fail. Oh, here we go. July, no. That was a fail. Let's click on that though. Because sometimes it'll take us. Okay, here's our forms update. So if you clicked on the red line and then scroll to the bottom, clicked on the July 2024 forms update link, it takes you to here. And then you should be able, no. I was like, it should be really easy, but it's taking me to a meeting instead of the actual form. So don't go there. The fastest way to get there, which is what I was going to show you guys originally, is by logging in. Go to access your transactions, like you're logging into Zip Forms. Come down here to access now. It's going to log you in if you're not logged in. If you are, it's going to give you the little yellow button to push. It's going to make me log back in. You can do it. I'm just waiting for it to validate my membership. All right. Usually what's going to happen is after this loads up, it's going to have a little pop-up box. Of course, it won't happen today because I want it to pop up, probably because I already clicked on it. But this is a fail here at the end of my class. Usually there's a little pop-up box that says, hey, view the forms updates there. You can click on the little button to say view redline forms. But let's go back to here now since it's going to be difficult. Oops. Hold on. I hit a button. All right, we're going to go search and we're going to go December 2024 forms. Let's see if that takes us where I need to go. All right, so I went to the search bar, December 2024 forms. Here's my top result is the 2024 forms release. We're going to click on that. You've got a quick summary guide there. You've got the new forms there. And then you've got all the revised form releases here. These are all the red line versions that we were looking at today. They're all right here under this section. So normally what I do is I go back to the summary of form releases chart here across the top. I bookmark this page because I know that they're going to release forms twice a year. This makes it really easy. So I just have it like car forms updates. And when it's getting closer, I can just come right back to this page, find the new forms and be able to look at them and review them. But that's how you'd find that information. Or like I said, generally speaking, it has been popping up on my Zip Forms when I open that. Any questions, thoughts, concerns, ahas before we wrap up today?
No, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for sticking with it. I tried to keep it as short as possible. There was a lot of little changes. Nothing super major. Biggest thing is that we no longer have to use that SPBB form any longer. We can just do it as part of the purchase agreement. So we will see you all next week on Tuesday at 9 a.m.